The folder was already open on my kitchen table when my daughter knocked on the door at 2:47 the morning. I hadn't slept. I don't sleep much anymore, not since my wife passed 4 years ago, not since the silence in this house stopped feeling like peace and started feeling like something else entirely. So I was sitting at the table with a cold cup of coffee and a folder I had been building for 11 days. And when I heard the knock, I already knew who it was, because only one person in this world still knocks instead of ringing the bell. My daughter has knocked on doors her whole life. I used to tease her about it when she was small. I am not laughing now. I closed the folder before I opened the door. She was standing on the porch in a coat that wasn't warm enough for November in Tennessee, holding her keys so tight her knuckles had gone white. Her eyes were dry. That was the first thing I noticed. My daughter cries at commercials about dogs. She cried at her own wedding, twice. Happy tears, she said, and I believed her then. Standing on my porch at 2:47 the morning with a coat that wasn't warm enough, her eyes were completely dry, and that scared me more than anything else could have. I said her name. I said, "Come inside." She sat at my kitchen table in the same chair she has sat in since she was 9 years old, and I put the folder in the cabinet under the sink, and I made her tea she didn't ask for, and I waited. I have spent 31 years waiting people out. The Army taught me to wait. The CID taught me to wait better. 2 decades as a warrant officer, investigating fraud, theft, assault, the things soldiers do to each other, and the things they do to civilians, when they think no one is keeping score, all of it came down, eventually, to sitting across from someone and being quieter than they were. I am very good at being quiet. My daughter is better. We sat for almost 8 minutes before she said anything. I know because the clock above the refrigerator has a second hand, and I watched it the way I used to watch suspects through one-way glass. Not impatiently, just carefully. She said, "I think I need to leave him." I said, "Tell me what happened tonight." She looked at her tea. She wrapped both hands around the mug the way her mother used to do in winter, thumbs overlapping, and she said, "Nothing happened tonight. That's not why I'm here. I'm here because tonight was a Tuesday and I have somewhere to be on Tuesdays. I have my book club. I have had book club every second Tuesday for 3 years, and he canceled it. He just canceled it. He texted the other women from my phone while I was in the shower, and he told them I wasn't feeling well, and he deleted the texts before I came out of the bathroom, and he didn't tell me he had done it. I got dressed, and I came downstairs, and he was watching television, and he looked at me, and he said, "You're not going anywhere tonight." And then he looked back at the screen, and I stood there in the living room for a long time, and I didn't say anything, and then I got in my car and I drove here. She stopped. She said, "That's not even the worst thing he has done this month." I said, "I know." She looked up at me then, fast, the way she used to look up when she was a teenager, and I caught her in something. She said, "What do you mean, you know?" I said, "Drink your tea. We'll talk about what I know in a minute. Right now, I want to hear what you want to tell me." She held the mug, and she talked for an hour and 40 minutes. I did not interrupt her once. She told me about the bank account he had moved her out of, quietly, in June, redirecting her direct deposit from their joint account to a new account only he could access, telling her it was for tax purposes, that his accountant had recommended it, and she had believed him because she had always believed him, because in the beginning, there had been no reason not to. She told me about the friends who had stopped calling, one by one over 3 years, each friendship ending in some small way she couldn't quite pin down, a misunderstanding, a scheduling problem, a silence that stretched too long. She told me she had mentioned it to him once, that she felt isolated, that she missed her friends, and he had held her face in his hands the way he used to do when they were dating, and he had said, "You have me," and she had thought that was love. She told me about the job she had left 18 months ago. A good job, project manager at a civil engineering firm, a job she had worked toward for a decade, and how he had been so supportive at first, so attentive, bringing her coffee when she worked late, asking about her colleagues. And then slowly the questions had changed. "Who is this, Mark, you keep mentioning? Why does your boss text you on weekends? I'm not accusing you of anything, I just want to understand." And after a while, she had found it easier to come home than to explain. And then one day she had just not gone back. She told me that last week he had stood in the doorway of the bathroom while she was getting ready, and he had looked at her in the mirror, and he had said, "You look tired lately. You should rest more." And she had smiled and said she was fine. And later that night, she had looked at herself in the mirror alone, and she had tried to remember the last time someone had told her she looked good, really looked good, not just tolerable, and she could not remember, and she had stood there in the bathroom for a long time after that. She finished talking and looked at her tea, which had gone cold. I said, "His name came up in an old case of mine. Not recently, 7 years ago, before he ever met you. I didn't know it was him until 11 days ago when I was going through archived files. I need you to understand that. I need you to understand that I am not telling you this to hurt you or to be right about something. I am telling you because you are my daughter, and because you came here tonight, and because what I found changes things." She looked at me for a long time. She said, "What did you find?" I told her to stay the night. I told her the guest room had clean sheets. I told her we would talk in the morning, all of it, everything, but that she needed to sleep first, and so did I. She said, "You don't sleep." I said, "I will tonight." She did not argue. My daughter is stubborn about most things, but she has always known when I am serious. And I was serious, and she went to bed, and I sat back down at the kitchen table, and I took the folder out of the cabinet, under the sink, and I opened it again, and I looked at the name at the top of the first page, and I thought about the 11 days it had taken me to be sure, and I thought about what I was going to do next. The plan was not complicated. It didn't need to be. I had not intended to open those files. I want to be clear about that, because what came next has a way of making it seem like I was looking for something, like I had suspicions I was already acting on. And that is not true. My daughter had been married to Derek Calloway for 4 years. I had met him 8 times before the wedding. I had walked her down the aisle. I had sat at a table with him at Thanksgiving and Christmas and her birthday for 4 years, and I had watched him cut her food for her. A small gesture, attentive, and I had thought he was thoughtful. I had thought my daughter was happy. I am a man who spent 3 decades reading people for a living, and I had thought my daughter was happy. I opened those files because of a conversation at the hardware store. A man named Gerald Fitch was in line behind me, buying weather stripping. Gerald Fitch worked for the district attorney's office for 20 years before he retired, and I had worked alongside him on 2 cases in the mid-90s, and we talked the way retired men in small Tennessee towns talk, slowly, about nothing important. And at some point he mentioned a civil case that had recently been settled. A woman from Clarksville who had sued her ex-husband for financial fraud and won. And he mentioned the ex-husband's name, and the name sat in the back of my mind for 2 days before I remembered why I recognized it. Derek Calloway. I went home and I dug out boxes that had been in my storage closet since I left the CID, and I found the name in an old case summary from 2014. At the time, I had been investigating a different matter entirely, and his name had appeared only as a peripheral contact, someone who had been dated briefly by a woman who was the real subject of my inquiry. I had noted him. I had not pursued him. There had been no reason to. There was reason now. I spent 11 days making phone calls. I still know people in this business. Some of them owe me. Some of them just remember what it meant to serve alongside someone honest, and that is its own currency. I called an old colleague in the Nashville field office. I called a paralegal I had worked with during a fraud investigation in 2008. I called Gerald Fitch back, and I asked him to tell me more about the Clarksville case, not the legal details, just the shape of it. And he talked for an hour, and what he described was so familiar, it made my chest hurt. The woman in Clarksville was named Patricia. She had married Derek Calloway in 2011. She had left 3 years later with nothing, or nearly nothing. Her name had been removed from bank accounts she didn't know existed. Her credit history showed a pattern of small loans taken in her name that she claimed she had not authorized. And by the time she understood what had happened, he had already filed for divorce on grounds she was still contesting. Her attorneys had fought for 4 years. He had settled quietly in 2019, a confidentiality clause attached, and he had moved to a different part of the state, and he had met my daughter at a charity fundraiser 6 months later. He was charming at charity fundraisers. I know this now. I have heard it from 2 different women. I thought about my daughter's bank account. I thought about her job. I thought about the book club he had canceled from her phone while she was in the shower, the small, efficient cruelty of it, and I felt something I have not felt in a long time, something I spent most of my career trying to be professional enough not to feel. And I sat at the kitchen table at 4 in the morning, and I let myself feel it, because there was no one there to see it, and because I think sometimes a man needs to let himself feel the thing before he can think clearly about what to do. Then I put it away. I put it in the same place I put everything I can't use, and I thought about the plan. In the morning, my daughter came downstairs in borrowed clothes, one of her mother's old cardigans that I still keep folded in the closet, and she sat at the kitchen table and I put eggs in front of her and I told her everything I had found. She didn't cry. She ate her eggs. She said, "How long?" I said, "The pattern in the Clarksville case started within the first year of the marriage." "You have been married 4 years." She said, "The money, the job, all of it." I said, "Yes." She was quiet for a while. She said, "I feel stupid." I said, "Don't." I said, "He is very good at this." I said, "The woman in Clarksville had a law degree." She looked at me then and she said, "What are we going to do?" I said, "We." "That means you are in." She said, "He is my husband." I said, "Yes." She said, "I want everything back. The money, my name, I want everything back. And I want him to not be able to do this to anyone else." I said, "That is exactly what we are going to do." I need to explain something about what I did next, because there is a version of this story where a retired military investigator puts on his old uniform and goes to knock on a door, and it looks like intimidation, like a man playing soldier after the fact. And I want to be honest about what I actually did and why. I did not pretend to have authority I no longer had. I am 63 years old, and I have been out of the CID for 8 years, and I know exactly what my badge means now, which is nothing, which is a piece of metal in a box in my closet that I keep because my wife gave it to me the day I was promoted, and I cannot bring myself to throw it away. What I had was something different. I had 31 years of knowing how these things work. I had a network of people who still trusted me. I had patience, which is the most underrated investigative tool in existence. And I had a daughter who was finally ready to tell the truth. The first call I made was to a family law attorney in Nashville named Beverly Hargrove. I had testified in a case she prosecuted 12 years ago, and she owed me nothing, and I called her anyway, because she is good and because she is mean in court in the specific way that matters. I told her what I had found. She was quiet on the phone for a moment, and then she said, "Send me the folder." And I said, "Which parts?" And she said, "All of it." The second call I made was to my daughter's bank. Not her joint account, her personal account. The one she had opened when she was 22. The one she had kept through the marriage because her mother had told her, "Always keep one account with your own name and no one else's." And she had listened to her mother even when she had not listened to me. The account had $416 in it. It was enough to start. The third call was the one that mattered. I called a forensic accountant named Dale Morrow, who had worked with our unit on a fraud case in 2006, and who had since built a practice in Nashville doing exactly this kind of work, following money through marriages, through businesses, through the complicated places people hide things when they think no one is looking. Dale said he would need 2 weeks and access to any financial documents my daughter could provide. My daughter spent 3 days photographing every piece of paper in that house while her husband was at work. She photographed things she didn't understand, and things she did, and things she wasn't sure about, and she sent them all to Dale. And Dale called me back in 11 days instead of 14 and said, "Your son-in-law has been busy." He had opened 3 accounts in her name between 2020 and 2022. He had taken loans against 2 of them. Her credit score was 91 points lower than it had been when they married, and she had not known it. The civil judgment from the Clarksville case was listed on his record, but had been disclosed to my daughter before the wedding as a business dispute, a misunderstanding, something that was behind him, and she had believed him. He was very good at being believed. Beverly called me on a Thursday morning and said, "I think we have enough to file." And I said, "What does that mean for her?" And Beverly said, "It means she gets the house, she gets the accounts, and depending on how aggressive we want to be, we may be able to have the loans investigated as fraud." I said, "How aggressive can we be?" Beverly said, as aggressive as she wants. I called my daughter. She was at work by then, a new job she had taken 3 weeks after she moved into my guest room, answering phones for a physical therapy clinic 3 days a week. Not the career she had left behind, not yet, but something that got her out of the house and put her name on a paycheck and made her feel like herself again in the small ways that add up. She answered on the second ring, the way she has always answered my calls, ever since she was a teenager with her first phone, never making me wait, as if she has always known that I worry. I do not tell her that. She already knows. I said, "Beverly thinks we are ready." She was quiet for a moment. I heard the sound of the physical therapy clinic behind her, someone counting reps, a machine running. She said, "Okay." I said, "Are you sure?" She said, "I have been sure for a while. I think I have been sure since before I came to your house. I just needed someone to hand me the folder." I said, "I wasn't going to hand you anything you didn't ask for." She said, "I know. That's why I came to your house." The papers were filed on a Monday. Beverly's office served him at work, which was Beverly's choice and not mine, and I respect it because she has seen enough of these cases to know that serving a man like Derek Calloway at home gives him the evening to make phone calls and move things around and prepare, and serving him at work in front of his colleagues removes all of that. He is a sales manager at a commercial real estate firm. He was served in the conference room during a staff meeting. Beverly told me later he had stayed very calm. He had thanked the process server politely and asked his colleagues to excuse him, and he had walked to his office and closed the door. Beverly said that was the most worrying kind of response. She had seen it before. I said, "I know. I want to tell you about the part that did not go according to plan. I want to tell you about it because if I only tell you the parts that worked, this becomes a different kind of story than it actually was. And my daughter asked me to be honest about all of it. Derek Calloway called me 10 days after the papers were filed. I don't know how he got my number. We had exchanged numbers when he and my daughter were engaged, and I suppose he had kept it the way you keep things you might need someday. He called on a Sunday afternoon while I was raking leaves in the backyard, and I looked at the screen and I thought about not answering. And then I answered. He said, "Robert, I want you to know that I love your daughter very much." I said, "I know you believe that." He said, "She has been under a lot of stress. I think she misunderstood some things about the way I handle our finances. I am happy to sit down with her and explain everything." I said, "That sounds like something you should discuss with Beverly Hargrove." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I hope you understand what you are doing to your family." I said, "I understand exactly what I am doing." He said, "She came to you. I want you to think about that. She chose to run to her father instead of talking to me, and I think that tells you something about the kind of person she has become, the way she—" I said, "Derek, I'm going to stop you there." I said, "I have a folder on my kitchen table with your name at the top of the first page. I have had it for 6 weeks. I have a forensic accountant, a family law attorney, a documented pattern from a previous marriage, and a daughter who has been photographing your paperwork for 3 weeks. I am not a man who makes threats, but I am a man who finishes what he starts, and I have been doing this for a very long time. Anything else you want to say to me, you can say to Beverly Hargrove." He hung up. I stood in the backyard, with the rake and the leaves and the November sky going gray at the edges, and I thought about the man my daughter had married, and I thought about the man I had walked her toward, and I thought about everything I had not seen. I have investigated fraud for 3 decades. I can read a financial document the way some people read sheet music, pattern and deviation, the thing that should be there and isn't, the thing that shouldn't be there and is. I did not read my own son-in-law. I was at the table with him for 4 years and I did not read him, and I have spent a long time sitting with that. I am not going to tell you I should have seen it sooner. I don't think that's useful. What I will tell you is that charming, patient, methodical people who do these things are very hard to read precisely because they have spent their entire adult lives learning to be unreadable. They do not get angry at family dinners. They do not say alarming things. They bring wine and ask your opinion about the football game, and they look at your daughter like she is the most important thing in the room, which she is, just not in the way you think. the way I should have known, and I say this not to blame myself, but to say it honestly, in case it is useful. The way I should have known was the job. When my daughter left a career she had worked for 10 years, I should have asked harder questions. I asked some questions. I accepted her answers because she seemed at ease, because she said she was relieved, because she said she was ready for something slower. And I thought I understood being tired. I thought I understood wanting quiet. Her mother had gone back to work part-time after my daughter was born, and I had been glad when she did. I thought about my wife, and I thought my daughter was making a different choice, a valid choice, and I let it go. I have thought about that a great deal. I have thought about the things we let go because we want our children to be happy, and about the ways that wanting can make you blind. The divorce proceedings took 8 months. I am not going to walk you through all of it because some of it is my daughter's story and not mine, and she has told me what she wants shared and what she doesn't. What I will tell you is that Dale Morrow's report was 43 pages long, and it documented 29 separate financial actions taken in my daughter's name without her knowledge or consent. Beverly presented it in discovery and described it later to me as watching someone try to argue that the sky was green. Derek Calloway's attorney was competent, but competent was not enough. He did not get the house. He got his personal accounts, the legitimate ones, and a car and half of a pension he had been contributing to since before they married, which was fair, and which Beverly accepted because taking it would have cost more than it was worth. My daughter got the house, and her name cleared, and a civil judgment for financial damages that she has since used to pay for the retraining program she is enrolled in. 18 months toward her project management certification, the same career she left, the same work she was good at. She also, at Beverly's recommendation, filed a report with the State Attorney General's office, documenting the pattern across both marriages. This was not a criminal complaint. Beverly was careful about the language. It was a report, a record, a document that exists now in a place where it can be found if someone else finds themselves, where Patricia from Clarksville found herself, or where my daughter found herself, or where some woman we don't know yet finds herself in a conference room or on a porch in November wondering how it got to this point. Patricia from Clarksville called my daughter in March. I don't know how she found her. Beverly suspects through the Attorney General's filing. She called, and they talked for 2 hours, and I don't know what they said because it was not a conversation I was part of, but my daughter came downstairs afterward and sat at the kitchen table, and her eyes were still dry, but her shoulders were different. Something had gone out of them, or maybe something had come into them. I have never been entirely sure which it is when a person finally exhales. She said she thought she was the only one. I said, "A lot of people think that." She said, "She's okay now. She remarried. She has a garden." I said, "Good." My daughter looked at me across the table and she said, "You knew before I came to you. You had the folder." I said, "I had suspicions. I had some things that looked like a pattern. I didn't know enough to say anything." She said, "Would you have told me if I hadn't come?" I thought about that for a while. I thought about my wife, who would have known what to say, who always knew the right distance between protecting someone and letting them find their own way. I thought about the 4 years of holidays and the dinners and the wine he brought and the way I had watched and nodded and said nothing. I said, "I was 2 days away from telling you. I had been trying to figure out how." She looked at me and I could see her deciding whether to believe that. After a moment she said, "Okay." I said, "I would not have let it go." She said, "I know. I came to you because I know that." She moved back into her own house in April. She had the locks changed, which was Beverly's recommendation, and she painted the kitchen a color her husband had specifically said he didn't like, which was my daughter's own idea, and I helped her paint it on a Saturday in May while the radio played. And she told me about the certification program and the women she had met in it, and the instructor who reminded her of a professor she had loved in college. And I rolled paint onto walls and listened and thought, there she is. There is my daughter, the one who has been in there this whole time. There is one more thing I want to say. There is a version of this story where I am the hero of it, where the retired investigator opens his files and saves his daughter, and everything falls neatly into place. And I want to tell you clearly that that is not what happened. What What happened is that my daughter saved herself. She saved herself the night she drove to my house at 2:47 the morning instead of going back upstairs. She saved herself the 3 weeks she spent photographing documents in a house where she was frightened, quietly, systematically, the way she has always done the things she has decided to do. She saved herself every time she answered my calls on the second ring, and every time she sat at that table and told me the truth even when the truth was hard. I handed her a folder. That is what I did. I handed her a folder, and I hired Dale Morrow, and I called Beverly Hargrove, and I raked leaves, and I answered a phone call on a Sunday afternoon, and I said what needed to be said. Those things mattered. I am not going to pretend they didn't. But my daughter is the one who knocked on the door. She calls me on Tuesdays now. Every Tuesday, the second Tuesday especially, because she restarted the book club, Different Women, a coffee shop downtown, and she calls me on her way home and tells me about the book, even when I haven't read it, which is almost always. I sit at the kitchen table and I drink coffee that is too hot, and I listen to her talk about characters in novels I will never open, and I think about the folder that is no longer on the table, the folder I shredded in January because it had done what it needed to do, and I think about the clock above the refrigerator with its second hand, and I think about the morning she sat across from me and said, "I want everything back." She has it back. Not all of it, not the 4 years, not the job she would have had, not the friendships that thinned and frayed. You don't get those things back. A man I served with told me once that recovery is not the same as return, and I think about that often. My daughter is not returning to who she was. She is recovering toward who she is going to be, which is something different, and I think from what I can see on Tuesday phone calls, it is something good. I am 63 years old, and I have one child, and she is going to be all right. That is the whole story. That is all I wanted to say.